I will do that now. Any questions, comments, or concerns about research or assignments or final papers before we get started in earnest? Great. And as previously indicated, recognizing that we have invited in external speakers to share their expertise with us, if you are in a place where it is safe and you are comfortable to do so, please turn on your cameras just so that everyone we can see each other and hopefully have a bit more engagement across the group. I think it makes it a bit more of a rewarding and valuable conversation. So today we are joined by Professor Sharon Fairley at the University of Chicago Law School to talk to us about civilian oversight of policing. You know, this is something that a fair few of you are researching in your current work. So I thought, in addition to always wanting to hear more from Sharon about her research, that this could be of direct impact and import to your own work. So Sharon, thank you for being with us today, and I hand the floor to you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. I'm delighted to talk to you about this topic about which I am very passionate, and have spent the last few years trying to really get a handle on what's going on in the world of civilian oversight of law enforcement. And so one of the things that I've been working on is one of the questions that I had a few years ago is because, I was working in the space here in Chicago, is that there was not a lot of data around like what form of oversight existed where and how prevalent the whole thing was. And so that's why I first started looking at civilian oversight and trying to measure where it was. And so I started studying the top 100 cities in the United States based on population. And I looked at where there's oversight, what form of oversight it was. And then I've been trying to kind of keep tabs on all those cities over the last couple of years. And so the first study, sort of benchmark study, came out in 2019. And then in May, I published an update because things have been happening since George Floyd's killing in 2020. Things have just really exploded. And so some of what you're going to see, or what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, comes from that. But I'm going to take a little bit more of a legal perspective today, since you guys are all law students, right? And so let me just go ahead and share my slides. And so I gave this presentation in some form a couple weeks ago at the International Association of the Chiefs of Police. And so they were very curious to learn about like what's going on in this space. It was a great engaged audience. And so the presentation was titled "Making Sense of the Evolving Legal Context of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement." And so, as I mentioned, there's just been a lot going on in this space in the last couple of years. And this chart is definitely based on the data that I've been collecting. So if you look at these 5-year increments for the last couple of decades, we see civilian oversight being created. And this is the number of new entities that were created during that 5-year time period. So there was definitely this big, kind of ramp up, right, in the 2015, 2019 time period. And that's when we had all these very, very visible national events happening nationally, like Laquan McDonald here in Chicago, like Philando Castile and Eric Gardner. There was just so many of those incidents that happened that were sparking activism that actually translated into a lot of oversight work. And then, of course, 25 entities just being created in the 2 years of 2020 and 2021. That's really, we're seeing activism in response to George Floyd really translating into activism. So at this point, in the 100 cities, there are about 71 that have at least one oversight entity. And as I'll talk about in a minute, many of the larger jurisdictions have more than one. And so we look at the prevalence of oversight. It's definitely it's almost universal in the largest 33 cities of the 100, but we see a lot of movement here in the smaller cities as well. So the prevalence is the penetration of civilian oversight is really growing. In my study, I try to break down and I sort of put the entities that I find into a box based on what I could call its primary function. And it's kind of a little bit of an arbitrary measure because many entities, as they're created, they do provide more than one of these functions. But I try to, based on their description and in the ordinance and the way the agency talks about itself, to sort of identify what is its primary purpose and the sort of oversight and accountability infrastructure in that city. And so I put them into these 7 different buckets. And so a review agency is an entity that's responsible for reviewing internal investigations conducted by the department itself, and then making findings and recommendations about those. So they view individual cases. An investigative agency has independent investigatory power to investigate misconduct or incidents. An advisory agency is one that provides, policy recommendations and advice and counsel to police, but doesn't have any real supervisory power. Supervisory agency is one that actually has functional supervisory power over the department. Those tend to be the police commissions. There are agencies that conduct appeals. So when disciplinary matters are decided and either the officer or the complainant disagrees with the outcome, they can appeal that to one of these agencies. Then we have the audit function, which tends to be the inspectors general that provide programmatic review of policing. And then the adjudicative agencies, those are the agencies that actually adjudicate disciplinary matters. For example, here we have the Chicago Police Board that hears cases anytime the officer is accused of a misconduct that results in a recommendation of a penalty of 30 days suspension or more, up to including termination. So that's just an example of an adjudicative agency. Sometimes these agencies exist in combination with others, and so we just see that some of them are more likely to be used in combination with another form of oversight. I mentioned in the larger jurisdictions, we're seeing many cities put together kind of systems of oversight. And so if you look at the larger cities, the top tercile, over half of them have more than one civilian oversight entity that's currently operating in the space. And so that's a trend that we definitely see in the last couple of years. So that's sort of the backdrop. Now let's talk about the legal framework for civilian oversight. So of course, we have the US Constitution, and as government entities, these agencies are beholden, right, to constitutional rules. They have to follow the Constitution. There's also state constitutions that have provisions that often impact the way civilian oversight operates and what they do. And then we have state statutes, and this is where we see just a tremendous amount of activity going on, particularly since George Floyd. Not only are states enacting state statutes that are directly related to the establishment and powers of oversight, we're also seeing states enacting statutes that directly impact the work, such as creating or abolishing law enforcement officer Bill of Rights legislation, as an example. So, and looking at state statutes, there are a bunch of different kinds that really affect the work of civilian oversight. So I first talked about the law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. So many, I think we're up to, in the 20s of the 50 states have statutes on the books that provide officers with rights when it comes to disciplinary matters. Those statutes were started off in the 70s as a way to really protect police from political interference, but they kind of evolved in a way that really it impacted accountability in a negative way. And so some states are actually dialing those back now. So for example, here in Illinois, we had the Safety Act of 2021 that dialed back some of those provisions to enhance accountability. There's state law that governs the access to disciplinary records. So California actually made inroads last year by changing the statutes that really precluded civilian oversight from having access to certain kinds of disciplinary records. Access to law enforcement records themselves. Sometimes, we have FOIA laws that impact how these entities can gain access. Law enforcement administration, there are some states that have, specific statutes that govern how law enforcement works. So, for example, in New Jersey, there's the Attorney General has a lot of power over how policing is done, at the local level. Then, of course, there's substantive criminal law, right, which is going to affect policing and how police officers work, and thus how civilian oversight evaluates their work. And then law enforcement establishment and powers. There's states that govern, that give cities the power to create police departments, right? And what they do. So there's a lot of state law out there that impacts the work. And then, of course, there's law at the municipal level that governs, that interferes with or interacts with civilian oversight. So, most civilian oversight entities are products of municipal law. So they're either created by ordinance or a change in city charter. And so there's also civil service rules that often govern the disciplinary process that civilian oversight entities have to follow. And then, of course, collective bargaining agreements, right, are often having provisions that impact the work that civilian oversight entities do. And then, of course, there's other substantive law that may exist at the local level that impacts the work. If you look across the country, this map sort of just shows, the state of state law relative to civilian oversight. Some states are hospitable to civilian oversights and others less so, right? And so we've seen that sort of change and that landscape change, particularly over the last couple of years, as we've seen state legislatures becoming more active in this space. So the green states are the ones that tend to be a little bit more hospitable to civilian oversight. So California usually ranks at the top. California is usually kind of at the top in terms of its progressiveness in general when it comes to police reform and criminal justice reform. And so they have a, their statutory structure tends to be more favorable. For example, last year, they enacted a state statute that enabled the creation of civilian oversight for sheriffs, which is more complicated because sheriffs are a constitutional office in most states. And so oversight of sheriffs becomes very complicated. There are other states in the pink or purple that you see that are a little less hospitable, right, to civilian oversight. So in 2019, when the city of Nashville decided it was going to create an oversight entity, the state legislature got together and said, we need to kind of wrangle ourselves around this. And they passed a statute that said civilian oversight can't have subpoena power, for example. Arizona tried to do that, but the way they did it was not technically correct. And so the Supreme Court struck down their statute where they tried to sort of limit the powers of civilian oversight. And that's why they kind of have them listed here with this sort of striped in pink, because there's a chance that they might reintroduce that legislation without the technical problems. And so it could come back. So looking at some of the recent states legislative work, there's some interesting things that I thought I might point out to you. So the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021, really interesting statute. It's part of a really broad omnibus police reform piece of legislation. But one of the big pieces of it was it actually requires that every county in the state of Maryland create a police accountability board. And then these disciplinary boards that work with it. And so there's an activist named DeRay McKesson. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He works for Campaign Zero, and who sponsored the whole 8 Can't Wait, police reform movement. And so he was instrumental in working on that piece. Oregon passed laws which, they passed a statute that said, look, cities can go ahead and create civilian oversight, but it's got to be based on a voter referenda. And they grandfathered in the places that had it already. And so, I mean, it's good, it allows for it, but it creates this additional hurdle that it can't be created unless the voters in the city have said they want it. I talked about the Tennessee statute. Virginia also just passed a statute that really opened the doors to civilian oversight. And
Sharon, I think your audio cut out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. I think maybe I put my hand on the mute or something. I'll try to not do so much with my hand gestures. And then there's some recent cases to talk about. So I mentioned the case in the state of Arizona, where they had put this bill that said that civilian oversight can't have subpoena power, and any board that can make disciplinary decisions has to be made up by 2/3 of law enforcement. And so they put this bill, they put these two provisions into a budget bill, right? And then passed it like at the last minute. And the Supreme Court said, that violated their sort of single subject rule for state legislation, and that they couldn't just squeeze that separate idea into this budget package. And so that's why I say there's a chance that maybe it'll come back, and that once they decouple it and do something different. The Fraternal Order of Police versus Newark case, that's a case it was like a roller coaster ride. That case went one way in the trial court, the appellate court went another way, and then it got to the Supreme Court. So the city of Newark was trying to create an agency pretty much modeled on the CCRB of New York City. And so at the end of the day, the New Jersey Supreme Court said, look, it's fine that it has that it can operate, but it can't do concurrent investigations with the police department. And so there were some other restrictions. The CCRB versus New York case, that was an interesting case. That board, so they had a board that decided that they were going to use their jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction said, that they could investigate complaints of verbal abuse or, abuse of power. And they took that language and said, we're now going to start investigating cases that involve sexual misconduct. And the court said, that's too much. You're expanding your jurisdiction. That's not what it was meant to say. So that was an interesting case. And then I'll just, the Kirkpatrick versus the city of Oakland, that's an interesting case too, because in that case, the city of Oakland, through a charter amendment, created this police commission and gave them the power to fire the superintendent of police, which is very rare in the world of civilian oversight. The board was created and they exercised that power and fired their chief of police. She sued them, claiming that she was wrongfully terminated, and that because the board had done some inappropriate things, and she won a judgment. And so that's kind of a cautionary tale for some of the boards. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of training to make sure that the boards are addressing that kind of misconduct. Looking at the legal authority that creates civilian oversight, you have legal authority for boards, right? So that's one form of oversight. And then there are agencies. And so just working through this list in terms of what you typically see in a piece of legislation that creates oversight for a board. The first thing is the size and composition. Most of the boards are somewhere between 5 and 25. The sweet spot is 9 to 13 members. And so we're seeing a lot of legislation that's getting more specific about the types of people they want on these boards, creating specific slots, for example, for young people or people with lived experience, or providing community members with the power to make nominations or recommendations. And so the method of nomination, again, the typical method is not nominated by the mayor, appointed by the city council. And so we're seeing some variations on that happening in real life as cities get more experimental with these things. Of course, an ordinance is going to define the duties and powers. So the way I think about that is subject matter jurisdiction, what kinds of cases they can handle, personal jurisdiction, meaning who they have oversight over. That tends to become an issue, particularly for sheriffs, because they oversee jails, right? And so you may have, if you have an ordinance that says they can only they can only look at matters with regard to sworn personnel, and sometimes you have unsworn personnel like medical personnel and detention aides, right, that are working. And so that can be a problem if the personal jurisdiction isn't broad enough. And then, of course, you have the definition of the duties. And so there's duties versus powers. So duties are where the ordinance says the agency or the board must do something. And then powers is where it may do it, so that the board has the discretion to take on certain kinds of cases or do certain kinds of things. And so you'll see those differences amongst the entities as well. Most civilian oversight operates, their responsibility operate in one of these 4 buckets: policy development, adjudicating disciplinary matters or investigating disciplinary matters, enhancing transparency of policing, and then community engagement. We often see also in the ordinances, there are high-level procedural things, like if they have hearings, there'll be the process, they'll lay out the process for hearings. Many cities are putting in these ordinances a duty to cooperate, meaning it's requiring city employees, police department employees to actually cooperate with the work of those entities. And then we see provisions related to transparency, so reporting, openness of meetings, that kind of thing. Agencies, a lot of times there will be definitions for who can serve and the leadership role for the agency, what are the characteristics or criteria for the executive director. Similarly, these ordinances are going to define duties and powers, operating procedures, duty to cooperate. A more recent trend is to look at a budget floor. Typically and historically, resources have been a challenge for civilian oversight entities. And so some cities are addressing that by putting in a minimum floor for the budget. And then, of course, reporting and transparency. So some of the more recent interesting things that have been happening. So Chicago just got this new community police commission. And so it is, the fourth, you can see kind of fourth civilian oversight entity that exists in the city. We had the police board, which was created in 1960, and then COPA and the Public Safety Inspector General were created in 2016. But now we have the Community Commission that's supervising all of this, including the police department. But I think the most interesting and unique thing about the new Chicago structure is that we will have elected district councils for each of the 22 police districts. There will be 3-member elected representatives to work directly on a local level on policing matters. So that's pretty unique, but the devil's in the details. We'll see what happens with that. Boston also created a pretty unique structure in the last 18 months. So they separated things out into 3 separate big buckets, where the middle bucket is an agency that investigates complaints. And then this agency is responsible for overseeing investigations of incidents like shootings and stuff. And then there's also a group that reviews the work of the internal affairs department within the department, all reporting to this 3-member commission. So that's kind of new and different for Boston. They had just one single agency before, the ombudsman, and they've sort of branched out. So what's the point of all this? So there, when you look at the research, there's no one right way to do civilian oversight, but there are some big themes that come across, right? So the jurisdictional scope, leadership, resources, independence, neutrality, and transparency. So jurisdictional scope, meaning if you have an agency where the jurisdictional scope is too limited, then it can't really have an impact on policing in the city. So the scope has to be large enough. It has to contain the right kinds of cases that the community is concerned about, and be broad enough. For example, when civilian oversight first started, some agencies were, it would say the jurisdiction was, well, whatever the superintendent wants them to look at. Right? That's not going to be too helpful, right? So jurisdictional scope is important. Leadership is also important. This is really complicated and hard work. And to do it correctly and properly, I mean, you have to have someone who's, is not for the faint of heart, right? Because a lot of times you're making somebody mad, right? If you come out with a ruling that says the officer, did something wrong, then the union's going to be mad and law enforcement is going to be mad. If you come out and say the officer was in the right, then sometimes the community's upset because they think they see, video from the incident and they have a hard time accepting that. So you have to have a leadership that can withstand that kind of controversy. Resources, I said, are incredibly important. Human, financial, and technical, right? That today's police investigations are really complicated. You have to be able to analyze video evidence, for example. And so you need the resources and the personnel to be able to handle those kinds of things. Structural independence is really important. So here in Chicago, the agency that I ran and was asked to reform, like the biggest problem was that it was not structurally independent from the police department. Like all its systems were connected to the police department, and it just didn't have that independence. So structural independence is important and includes key things like having subpoena power and having direct access to law enforcement information. If an agency is constantly having to ask the police department for reports and evidence and information, then they can say, well, okay, yeah, sure, I'll get it to you, and then it can delay the process and undermine the integrity of the process. And so having direct access to material is really critical. Looking at the issue of subpoena power, this is just some data from my study. It shows that, about half have it. I call, independent subpoena powers when the agency can do it all by themselves. Some of it have derivative, meaning they can get subpoenas, but they have to ask the city council or corporation council to do it for them. There's a piece of the pie missing here, but oops. The top piece is boards or agencies, and so this is how this is structured. Sorry, I'll have to fix that slide. And when we look at subpoena power, what's interesting is that it's highest where you have an entity that is a combination of a board and an agency together. And I think that perhaps the reason is when you have this sort of, one is a check on the other, right? And so that's why cities feel more comfortable giving subpoena power to that entity, because you have a board that can be a check on the investigative agency, right? And so that's kind of interesting. Neutrality is important. If a civilian oversight entity gets a reputation for being law enforcement friendly, then the community is disappointed. If it gets a reputation for being totally driven by the community without concern at all for law enforcement issues and needs, then law enforcement is upset, right? And that can cause problems as well. So it's important that entities have that neutrality. And then, of course, transparency. They've got to be really transparent about the work they do. In order for people to understand what's going on and whether or not they're effective, they have to be transparent about issuing reports on their findings and the work. And then at the end of the day, it's all about trust and legitimacy, right? And so that's the key here, is that, proving, having civilian oversight, it flows directly out of the concept of democracy, and that, communities, when they bestow policing powers on law enforcement, it's amongst the most serious powers that they give their government. It's the power to take away life and liberty. And so communities want to have a say in that. And they want to make sure that those powers are being exercised in a legitimate way. And so trust and legitimacy is one of the big reasons and big themes behind the creation of civilian oversight. So that's my story, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Sharon, thank you so much. It was wildly useful and a great deal of information in a short period of time. While folks start to assemble their questions, I do want to hand the floor momentarily to Justin Aragoza, who is our law school consortium fellow at Albany, who is, as part of his research with us, is partnering with the Albany Community Police Review Board, and Justin, just recognizing that this was so closely connected to the work that you've been undertaking, wanted you to get the first opportunity to both respond to what you've heard and perhaps apply how some of these lessons that Sharon has just touched upon to what you've learned in the Albany context.
Thanks, Jesselyn. Yeah, so I this semester scaled down what you have done. So we looked at it from an internal to New York perspective, and we focused a little bit differently. We focused on how the statutes were written within the communities in New York, and with a goal of pulling out language that other communities could use in the future if they wanted to create this. And the reason we did that was because following George Floyd's killing, then Governor Cuomo put out an executive order. So New York doesn't have a statute yet. Right. It's in the works. But there's an executive order that was put out that required every community, every single municipality in the state to at least conduct a audit, basically, of their community police situation and come up with a plan for the future. Mm-hmm. Many of those communities ended up not doing anything more than just the plan, right. And then they decided that they were good, but there were several that either revamped their existing boards or created new ones. So we took a look at the 18 statutes that exist in New York and kind of pulled them apart, and took out language we felt was useful for another community to use if they decided to create one in the future. And I found some very interesting stuff. A lot of stuff was very similar to what you found, subpoena power. I think, hold on, let me pull up. Oops. For us, only 4 of the 16 that I looked at had the ability to subpoena, so it was a lower percentage. And I think of those 3 were exclusive. They could do it on their own, and one had to do it through the Common Council. And I also focused a lot on the membership itself, how they were being built. A lot of them tended to be mayoral appointments, just by city charter requirements for the most part. And then in the chat, I posted a case. Rochester is currently in litigation with its the city police's union over some statutory language involved with disciplinary powers.
Yes.
And so that is actually waiting to go to the New York State Court of Appeals. We're waiting for that. So that case will be interesting when it comes out, as far as what it will mean for some of the statutory language going forward. We're unsure if it'll impact the state generally. It's going to kind of depend on how they word the language, but it's been interesting. I attended a couple of meetings, and some of the small scale stuff like budgeting and stuff. It's really interesting how much it impacts what they can or can't do.
Right.
For instance, Albany only has a 1% budget, which is, kind of very small compared to some of the other boards around. But interestingly, even though they only have a 1% budget, they just worked with the local police department, and they now have file share access. So they have direct cloud access to all of the internal stuff. There's a lot of internal, policies that they have to go through, but it's a step in the right direction. So
fantastic. Wow, that sounds so interesting. I hope you will share it or publish it or do something so people can have the benefit of it. I mean, and definitely, have you connected to the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement on that?
Not to my knowledge yet. Our intention, so next week I'm taking my research to our local, so our government law center at our school is the administrative body that supports the Albany government Albany Police Review Board.
Sure.
So we're taking our research to them tomorrow. It's going to get, or this next week, it's going to get refined based on some feedback from them. And then depending on how that goes, our intention is to publish it as a white paper for now. And then another fellow is taking on some of the less statutory and more community-based concepts next semester, and we'll continue it from there.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for doing that. That sounds wonderful. A great addition to the academic study in this world. So thank you for doing that.
Want to make sure that information is flowing both from the experts as well as our budding experts in this group.
Yes,
so,
love it. Love
awesome.
it.
Thank you for that. Shelby, you had your hand raised earlier. And while you're asking your question, please, others, if you want to throw your hands up, I can add you to the queue.
Hey, thank you for your information. I just wanted to ask, as someone that's not familiar with the civilian oversight world of all of police conduct and research, do we have the data yet that says if these boards in effect are changing police behavior or making communities more comfortable with their police interactions or relationship? I'm just wondering if, since it is so new, do we have any basically data results of what the impact is?
Sure, that's a really good question. I would say not yet. Right. I think, there's been some work. It's been fairly limited. The amount of empirical study that's going on in this space has been very, very limited. And, so I get this question all the time. It's sort of like, why is everybody doing this when there's not where's the data, right? And it's funny because when the President Obama's 21st century task force on 20th century policing, when they issued their report, I think this was back in 2016, they came out with a number of recommendations, right, for policing writ large, but they did recommend that every community examine the concept of civilian oversight. And in doing that, they actually acknowledged that there's still very limited empirical study to show that this actually does anything. But the thing is, people still want it. Why? Because people want to say in how policing is done. I mean, there's just no, right? I mean, it's like I said, that's the idea. People feel more comfortable and are more likely to believe in the legitimacy of law enforcement when they believe that they have a say in how policing is executed. I believe that we will see in the coming years more empirical work done to support that thesis, but there's very limited evidence as we stand here today.
Thank you.
David?
Hi. So I have a very broad question, a very specific question. So I wanted to start with the broad question. I mean, the precise question, and then maybe if there's time later, I'll ask the broader question. But I just wanted to ask about that duty to cooperate. Like when you, I know that's a big problem with our police commission in Detroit, and I think police commissions in general. But so that sounds good in theory, but I know you can't make somebody do something that's against the law. And when you're not cooperating, the argument is always like, that's against the law, we can't do it, or that's not what we agreed to before, or something like that. So how does such a duty work that it wouldn't end up just being ineffective?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And so that duty has to exist with the other law in the background. So you'll have the legal concepts like, for example, garrity, right? You can't, if you compel a police officer to make a statement, then you cannot use that statement against him in a criminal case, right? And so sometimes if you have an administrative investigation going on and you want to compel an officer to make a statement, and you're concerned that the conduct might rise to the level of being a criminal offense, you're going to have to take precautions to make sure that you don't taint any potential criminal investigation, right? And usually agencies are set up with a firewall system to address that concern. But like you said, there can also be background rules and collective bargaining agreements that are going to govern, right? So for example, here in Chicago, the collective bargaining agreement has very specific rules around how and when officers can be interviewed about a shooting incident, right? Like for an officer who discharged his weapon, you can't interview that person until 24 hours later, right? So this duty can only function within the context of the other legal rules that exist around it. But in some cases, it can be very powerful, right? Particularly when it comes to access to information, right? So you have to, that's really important because access to information can really slow the process down and affect the integrity of an administrative investigation. So if a police department is not forthcoming with the appropriate documents and reports and information, then that can really undermine the success of an investigation. So I think that's where the duty to cooperate is really the most important.
Was there a second part to your question, David?
Well, I guess I just wanted to ask, because I'm very familiar with the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners, which I wrote about a few last year. So created in 1974, on paper, incredibly strong. It has all of the keys to success that you named and some others. It actually creates police policy under the theory that you can't change police practices unless you actually have control over what they do. And yet there hasn't been a positive thing said about it in the past 30 years. So I'm curious how you explain that. Not necessarily for Detroit, but or if you can speak to Detroit specifically, I'd be fascinated. But just in general, when these fail, why do they fail?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I love that question. So I wish I could speak to Detroit. I can't. And I will say it's not for lack of trying. I literally am in the middle of a project that I'm presenting at a NACOL webinar on Wednesday. That's on data that I've been collecting around the ability of investigative agencies to be able to keep up with their caseload. And so we've been collecting data from all the agencies that do those kinds of investigative, administrative investigations independently from the police department. And of course, Detroit has the office of the chief investigator under the police commission. And I FOIA'd, I called, they sent like they're the only agency I literally got nothing. And so I wish I could speak to them. I can't. I don't know anything about what they do. But to your broader question about why do these things fail? So here in Chicago, which, I've gone on record and said historically, Chicago's the poster child for failed civilian oversight. So if you look at the investigative agency that exists in Chicago, it's currently the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. Before that, there was an agency that was called the Independent Police Review Authority. So IPRA was its nickname. Now, IPRA was created out of a, police brutality crisis, right? There was this officer that was on video beating up a bartender, and, Chicago, all hell broke loose. And so the mayor was up against the wall and had to do something. So they decided they were going to create this independent agency. And just like you said, like on paper, it looked amazing, right? It had subpoena power. It had jurisdiction to investigate excessive force, domestic violence, coercion, verbal abuse, shootings, tasings, deaths in custody. It had like the right jurisdiction. And, it was, given these things, but it just did not actually happen as it was executed. So what happened was, in reality, they had an internal group of civilians that were doing these investigations, and they literally just moved them to a new building and slapped the name IPRA on the door, right? They didn't change anything about the way the agency operated. So they didn't really break the tethers from the police department. So in general, when these things fail, it's because there is that lack of independence. The independence just doesn't happen, right? And when you look at the jurisdictions where there is a police commission, they tend to be the ones that have been around for since the 1800s, right? So that's LA, St. Louis, Kansas City. Those are all cities that have these long-standing police commissions that have plenary supervisory power over the police department. They can actually define what the police department does. I don't know if the Detroit Police Commission has that amount of power. I just don't know. I haven't looked at the ordinance. Jamie?
Hi, I'm not going to turn on my camera because I'm sick, and I'm going to just save all of you from that. But you just said something that brought up a second thought for me. But I'm from St. Louis, and so I don't find community policing in St. Louis to be very the community boards and policing to be trustworthy at all. Like, the police is a huge problem in St. Louis. So I'm shocked to hear you say that it's like a trustworthy or a more trustworthy institution. That's like literally the most shocking thing that I've heard in this entire conversation.
I didn't say that they were more trustworthy.
Sorry, I guess more long-standing, successful, quote unquote.
They have more power is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Right. But still, like, there's civilian oversight in St. Louis. However, so even having a civilian supervisory police commission is, like I said, is not sufficient, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to,
my original thought, which is, and I don't know that much about this, but do you feel that one of the issues is that there's such a lack of trust in minority communities from police? And is there enough minority support in these civilian oversight communities to really actually shed light on the real issues between police and the things that need to happen to kind of make changes within the policing in between policing departments and policing practices to kind of help real communities? Like, is there that level of representation in the civilians who are overseeing these boards?
Yeah, I guess I would say that a couple things. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, in order to create a civilian oversight entity, whether it's a board or an agency, it usually requires either an ordinance or a change to the city charter. That is legislation. In order to get legislation passed, you have to be able to build sufficient political consensus to get an ordinance across the finish line, right? Now, usually what happens is you have activists who are fighting, for civilian oversight, and you have law enforcement pushing back against it. And so in the context of that political process, what happens is there's compromise. And so in general, the civilian oversight that gets created is never going to be as strong as what activists want and what really can make a big difference, right? It's always going to get watered down a little bit in that political process, right? And so, we start there. But I think the bigger issue that you're raising is something that has come up more frequently and is being discussed more broadly in the civilian oversight community. And that's the difference between oversight that happens at the front end versus the back end. When you look at civilian oversight, historically as it's evolved, it has tended to focus on back end solutions, meaning agencies that investigate misconduct after it already happened, agencies that inspectors general that review police behavior after it's already occurred, right? And so that's at the back end. We have communities that are now recognizing that in order to really make a difference in how policing is done in their communities, they need more say at the front end. They need more say in the policymaking space. And historically, most entities have been only advisory in nature. You can have an entity and they can make policy recommendations. That's it. I mean, sometimes the police department will actually be required to respond to those recommendations, but that doesn't mean they have to accept them or adopt them. Now, when I put up the slide about Chicago, that's one of the unique things about the new commission in Chicago is that they do have some teeth to their policymaking. It's not 100%, but they can, for example, like override by going to the city council and getting the city council to agree with their policy recommendations. And so I think we're seeing more work going on to create more power at the front end to address the issues that you raise. Does that answer your question?
It does a lot. Thank you. You answered the idea I was trying to grasp, which is like a lot of these issues feel like they could be fixed well in advance of when they're being fixed. And
Yes.
I don't, but that comes from, you're correct, talking to people, and people don't like to do that. So
Yeah. Justin, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just quick on that same point. So from what I found in New York, of the 16 that I pulled statutes for and did my research on, 0 had the ability to enforce any of their recommendations.
Right.
On the policy end. Like there was a couple that have some enforcement of disciplinary power, but even those are limited and potentially void based on this new case. So I think that's definitely a big factor when it comes to what they can and can't do. And I think the other point that you made earlier about restrictions on budgets is a big factor. If they don't have the financial power to do anything, then they're kind of just a figurehead.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
Is anyone else aware of review boards in their communities that you would like to share a bit of information around or create more linkages between Sharon's expertise and what you know is happening in your community? Well, perhaps that's space for additional research. Jan.
Yeah, Excuse me. Yeah, I'm from ASU. So in Phoenix, the Phoenix city tried to, like you were saying, open up the Office of Accountability and Transparency. But in the House bill that did get struck down by the Supreme Court, it ended up being renewed. The Arizona Senate put it through a new House bill that didn't that wasn't subject to the one line
Right.
rule more.
So did it pass?
I'm
Did it
sorry.
pass? Did it pass? Did they get it
did
through?
pass, and I think they are challenging it again, but they also say at the same time that the Phoenix office is going to try to accommodate itself to the
Mhm,
bill language, and they're
mhm.
doing that. But at near the same time, not Phoenix, Arizona also passed the bill to not, it doesn't create civilian review, but what it does, it opens up a department and like dedicates like $25 million, I think, to the Department of Public Safety for independent investigations. So,
Mhm,
it's not exactly civilian review, but it is something in that area.
mhm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so there's some that is one approach, right? Is to sort of take things up to the state level, right? And to try to do some oversight there. I think Connecticut has a system that's kind of like that as well. Um, but that's one way that law enforcement has kind of tried to counterbalance these things, is to try to get their posts, their police officer standard training board more active in this space, right? And to give them more power to do these things so that they could say that you don't need civilian oversight because we have these checks and balances over here. So that's definitely something that that's happening. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I hadn't been keeping track about what's going on in Phoenix. So thank you for telling me.
Any other questions or comments from the various communities that we have represented here? No? All right. Oh, Shelby.
Sorry, it took me a second to hit it before you said okay. But I just wanted to say that I did look it up while we were sitting here, and the only oversight committee in the entire state of Louisiana where I am is New Orleans, because that's our most famous city. But it's not our largest city anymore after Hurricane Katrina. It is now Baton Rouge, where I'm located at LSU.
Right.
And Baton Rouge has its own complicated history and terrible policing practices. I mean, we've had multiple infamous killings here of unarmed Black men. And I mean, just being located in the Deep South already, we have a lot of issues. So
Mhm.
I would wish that we could have more in the future, but I really do believe that my state, and I've lived here my whole life in different cities, is just so unwilling to check police power. I don't know if that's political. I think cultural, political, everything that we can contribute the issue to, but I really, really feel bleak about the possibility of it continuing into other cities here.
Yeah, I think first of all, I sympathize. I get it. I see the same thing with Alabama, right? There hasn't been a lot. And I don't even think there's been a lot of success with police reform outside of civilian oversight, right? So when you look at what's been going on in the last couple of years, civilian oversight is just one piece of the kind of police reform legislation that's been happening around the country, right? We've had changes in, state law regarding use of force, changes in state law regarding certification and decertification of police, changes with regard to, the law enforcement officers' bills of rights. There's been all sorts of things going on. And so, yeah, so like I said, it is inherently a political process. And so where there is that, where that political consensus does not exist, then it becomes very, very difficult. But it's not impossible. There are communities that have gotten things across the finish line, like New Orleans, right? And then definitely some places in Tennessee I know, obviously Nashville was successful. There's work going on in Knoxville also. And so there's been some success. And then, of course, in the Carolinas, North Carolina, there's a lot of activism going on in North Carolina working towards this as well. And so I would, if you're interested in trying to learn more about how to have success in that kind of political environment, I would definitely, reach out to some of the activists who've been successful in those communities. And I'm happy to make those connections for you if that would be helpful to you.
It had turned what could have been a bleak moment into one of hope. I appreciate that. Justin.
Yeah, I have a question that's kind of in a completely opposite direction, just to maybe take it out of this a bleaker mood. So when you've been looking at membership, do you notice any kind of correlation with effective or ineffective review boards based on who is controlling the nomination? So if it's one where it's controlled by the office of the mayor compared to a community organization, or even one where there's some overlap between the common council or the city council and the mayor, and if so, like, is it happening in the larger cities and not the smaller cities? Because I'm not looking at the effectiveness right now, but I think it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I have not done any kind of correlation with effectiveness. I do, as part of my database, I do keep track of the a nomination and appointment method. So I can tell you that, like I said, like the vast majority, it's like the mayor nominates and the city council approves. There are some rare exceptions to that, but the vast majority of cities, that's the way it's done. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, I can go back and look at my spreadsheets, and I can tell you where the cities that have done it differently. If you're interested in that, just shoot me an email.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure I'll be shooting you an email
Okay.
at some point.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
I always love to see collaborative conversations happening in the chat. Thank you, David, for sharing that. And right, any other questions, points of contention, points of concern?
All right.
No. Well, Sharon, thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure.
Us sharing your brain, sharing your energy with us. I think it was a really fruitful, very interesting conversation.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I thank you all for doing the work that you're doing and your studies. I wish you all the best. And if you think of anything, just shoot me an email. Happy to help or answer questions as they arise.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Take care.
Everyone, enjoy your evening, and don't forget the midterms tomorrow. If your phone has not already been blowing up, to go vote if you have time to do so, and are able to in your environment, please do so. Democracy appreciates you.
Absolutely. Take care.
Enjoy your evening.
Wait, oh no, I hope the people from Louisiana didn't log off yet. I see, Monique, are you still here?
Yeah.
Okay, there is a ballot, a Louisiana constitutional amendment on the ballot concerning involuntary servitude being allowed to continue for being convicted of a